Across the VFL-AFL's entire history, dating back to 1897, there have been 50 grounds in which VFL-AFL matches have been held. Today we're going to be going through every single ground, oval or stadium ever played on in the entire VFL-AFL history. We'll be going through all 50 of them in chronological order. So let's start with the very first day of VFL football, Round 1 1897 on the 8th of May, which saw games played at Brunswick Street Oval, Victoria Park, Corio Oval and Lakeside Oval. Brunswick Street Oval, located in Fitzroy North, was the home ground of the Fitzroy Football Club in the VFL from 1897 to 1966 and saw the club win all 8 of their premierships. The club moved away from Brunswick Street Oval ahead of their 1967 season, due to the oval being in an unusable condition for football and the Fitzroy Cricket Club refusing to support much needed renovations. The first game played there was Round 1 1897 and the final game played there was against St Kilda in Round 17 1966. The ground is now used by the Fitzroy Junior Football Club in the YJFL and the Fitzroy Amateur Football Club in the Victorian Amateur Football Association. Corio Oval in East Geelong served as Geelong's original home ground from the start of the VFL in 1897 until 1940. At the beginning of 1941, Corio Oval was taken over by the Army to be used as a training camp during World War II, so the club relocated to Kardinia Park. After World War II, the club decided to remain at Kardinia Park. The move eventually became permanent, meaning the final game ever played at Corio Oval was in Round 17 1940. The ground was eventually demolished in 1981 and there is now a conference centre on the site. Lakeside Oval or Lake Oval in Albert Park was South Melbourne's home ground from 1897 up until 1981, excluding a brief period during World War II when the ground was used as a military training base. Notably, Lakeside Oval hosted the 1901 Grand Final. The final game played there was Round 22 1981, as in the following year South Melbourne relocated to Sydney and became the Sydney Swans. The ground has undergone significant renovations since then and is now no longer an oval but an athletics track surrounding a soccer pitch and is known as Lakeside Stadium. It serves as a home base for Athletics Victoria, Athletics Australia and South Melbourne FC. Victoria Park in Abbotsford was Collingwood's home ground in the VFL from 1897 up until the late 1980s, when they slowly started playing more home games at the EMCG due to capacity restraints at Victoria Park. The ground also served as Fitzroy's primary home ground in 1985 and 1986. Round 22 1999 between Collingwood and Brisbane was the last AFL game played there. Collingwood retained Victoria Park as their training and administrative base until 2004 when they moved to the Olympic Park precinct. Today the ground is still used by Collingwood's VFL side as well as their AFLW and VFLW sides. Their AFL side also occasionally trains there. The weekend of Round 2 1897 on the 15th of May saw the first games played at 3 more grounds, the East Melbourne Cricket Ground, Junction Oval and the Melbourne Cricket Ground. The East Melbourne Cricket Ground, located in East Melbourne, was the home ground of Essendon in the VFL from 1897 until the ground was closed in 1921. The ground also hosted a grand final in the year 1900, in a time before the MCG permanently hosted it. It was also the home ground of the Melbourne University Football Club in their first 3 years in the VFL, 1908 to 1910, but they moved to the MCG in 1911 due to disputes with Essendon over rent. The ground was closed in 1921 and then demolished in 1922 to make room for an extension of the Jolimont Yard railway sidings. One of the stands from the ground was relocated to Hawthorn's Glenferrie Oval as the East Melbourne Cricket Club merged with the Hawthorn Cricket Club. The final game to be played there was in Round 17 1921. The site is now a residential area with apartment buildings being built there in the 1990s. Junction Oval in St Kilda hosted St Kilda's home games from 1897 up until 1964, excluding 1942 and 1943 when the ground was being used by the Army. The Oval was also used by South Melbourne from 1944 to 1946, as their normal home ground Lakeside Oval was also being used by the Army. Junction Oval hosted 3 grand finals in 1898, 1899 and 1944. In 1965, St Kilda relocated to Moorabbin as they wanted autonomy over their own venue rather than sharing it with the cricket club. In 1966, the Sandringham Football Club and the VFA played their home games there, but they moved back after only a year. However, this wasn't the end of VFL football at the Junction Oval, as in 1970, Fitzroy moved in. Fitzroy played their home games there until 1984 when they were kicked out. The final VFL game played there was in Round 22 of 1984 and was fittingly between Fitzroy and St Kilda. The ground was then used from 1985 to 2010 by Melbourne as their training ground. The ground was also used by Old Melburnians Football Club and the Victorian Amateur Football Association until 2015, when the ground ceased hosting football games altogether. The ground is now used as a full-time cricket venue and hosts tenants such as Victoria's men and women's teams, the Melbourne Stars, the Melbourne Renegades and the St Kilda Cricket Club. Next up we have the one and only Melbourne Cricket Ground, the MCG, located in East Melbourne. The MCG was initially only Melbourne's home ground, but as the years went on, more and more teams started playing home games there, with it now being seen as a general ground with its name being almost synonymous with Australian rules football itself. Melbourne has played its home games at the MCG from 1897 until today, except for 1942 to 1945 when it was used as a military training base for World War II. It was also traditionally Melbourne's training base as they trained here up until the end of 1984. The first other team to begin playing games at the MCG was Richmond, who began in 1965 and still do today. The next team was North Melbourne, who played their home games there from 1984 until 2005. Soon after North, Collingwood started playing home games at the MCG, with it becoming their permanent home ground from 2000 onwards. It was Essendon's primary home ground from 1992 until 1999, and they still play some home games there now. It has been Hawthorn's main home ground since 2000 and one of Carlton's two main home grounds since 2005. It has also held all but 11 grand finals and hosts countless other sports and major events in Melbourne. In round 7, 1897, which was on the 22nd of June, the final one of the original 8 teams' home grounds hosted its first VFL game, which was Princes Park. Princes Park is in Carlton North and hence hosted almost all of Carlton's home games from 1897 all the way until 2005. The ground has also been the home ground for many other VFL-AFL teams over the years, such as South Melbourne in 1942 and 1943, Fitzroy from 1967 until 1969 and then later from 1987 to 1993, Hawthorn from 1974 until 1991, the Western Bulldogs from 1997 until 1999, and have also hosted the occasional neutral games during the 1990s and the early 2000s. Princes Park has hosted 3 grand finals, 1942, 1943 and 1945. Today, Princes Park is named Icon Park under naming rights, and it remains the training and administrative base for Carlton, even after recently undergoing significant renovations which reduced its capacity from 35,000 to 13,000. It still hosts many AFLW, VFL and VFLW games, as well as pre-season AFL games. Surprisingly, the next new ground to be played at was the Sydney Cricket Ground, which saw its first VFL game on the 23rd of May 1903, which was in round 4. The match was between Fitzroy and Collingwood and was an exhibition match. 1903 also saw another match played at the SCG, which was in round 2, between Geelong and Carlton. The game was originally slated to be held in early May in Geelong, but due to a railway strike it was postponed and played at the SCG on the 3rd of August. There was also another exhibition match held there in round 4 1904, between Melbourne and Essendon. The SCG then wasn't used for another football game until round 8 1952, in what was called National Day Round, but became known colloquially as Propaganda Round. It was sort of like an old version of Gather Round, but I will get back to this later when we get to the other ovals used. After 1952, the SCG was used for VFL games when it hosted a few games every year from 1979 to 1981. Then in 1982, the struggling South Melbourne Football Club, nicknamed the Swans, moved all their home games there. They briefly became known as just the Swans, but once settling into their new location, they officially changed their name to the Sydney Swans. Since then, the SCG has been used as Sydney's home ground and main training oval. It has also hosted a couple other games here and there, such as a few Kangaroos games in the late 90s and early 2000s, as well as a few neutral games during the COVID years, notably the Queen's Birthday game between Melbourne and Collingwood in 2021. In 1908, the VFL was expanded from 8 teams to 10 teams as Richmond and University joined the league. University became co-tenants with Essendon at the East Melbourne Cricket Ground, which means 1908 only saw one new ground, Richmond's Punt Road Oval. Punt Road Oval in East Melbourne hosted its first ever league game in round 1 1908 and was the home ground for Richmond from 1908 up until 1964 when they moved their home games to the MCG in 65. Punt Road Oval was also used as Melbourne's home ground from 1942 to 1946 and for one game in 1956 due to the military occupying the MCG during World War II and preparations for the Olympic Games taking place at the MCG during round 4 of 56. The final game played there was in round 18 1964, which saw Richmond lose to Hawthorn. Today, Punt Road Oval remains Richmond's training and administrative base and still hosts home games for Richmond's AFLW and VFL sides. Windy Hill, or officially the Essendon Recreation Reserve, located in Essendon, was Essendon's home ground from 1922 until 1991. As mentioned earlier, up until 1921, Essendon played their home games at the East Melbourne Cricket Ground, but due to its closure at the end of the 1921 season, Essendon had to find a new ground to play at. Essendon resettled in Essendon and made Windy Hill their home ground. The first game to be played there was in round 1, 1922, and the final game to be played there was in round 21, 1991. From 1992 onwards, Essendon began playing their home games at the MCG, but they retained Windy Hill as their primary training and administrative base. This changed in 2013 when they moved to their new facilities in Melbourne Airport, known as the Hangar, due to size constraints that would have limited a potential redevelopment of Windy Hill. Today, the ground is still used by the Essendon Football Club as their AFLW, VFL and VFLW home ground. 1925 saw the expansion of the VFL from 9 teams to 12 teams, with the inclusion of Hawthorn, Footscray and North Melbourne, which means it was also the introduction of 3 new grounds. Glenferrie Oval in Hawthorn was the home ground of the Hawthorn Football Club in the VFL from when they joined in 1925 up until 1973. The first game played there was in round 1, 1925 against Richmond, and the final game to be played there was in round 22, 1973 against South Melbourne. Hawthorn continued to use Glenferrie Oval as their training and administrative base up until 2006, when they moved out to Waverley Park. Today, Glenferrie Oval is used by the public as a community ground with no full ground football matches taking place. Hawthorn rarely return to the ground, with some instances in recent times being supporter days, which are held after they win the premiership, and family days at the start of the year. However, these appearances seem to be dwindling as Family Day this year was held at Waverley Park. The Boroondara Council, who owns the ground, is currently undergoing a revitalisation project for the ground, with the Ferguson stand being knocked down to make way for a new open space, and the heritage-listed Michael Tuck stand is set to be revitalised. Hopefully this paves the way for Hawthorn to host more events at the ground. The next ground up is Arden Street Oval in North Melbourne, which was the home ground of North Melbourne from 1925 to 1985, excluding 1965 when North temporarily moved to Coburg. The first game to be played there was in round 2, 1925, and the final game to be played there was in round 20, 1985. Arden Street Oval is still used by North Melbourne as their training and administrative base, as well as hosting their AFLW, VFL and VFLW home games. Whitten Oval, or more traditionally known as Western Oval, is located in Footscray and hosted the Footscray Football Club's VFL AFL home games from 1925 to 1997, excluding 1942 when the ground was being used by the military. The first game to be played there was in round 2 of 1925, and the final game to be played there was in round 21 of 1997. Today the ground is still used by the Footscray Football Club, who now go by the name the Western Bulldogs in the AFL, as their training and administrative base, and still host AFLW, VFL and VFLW matches. The next new ground to be used was the Motordrome, located in Melbourne. This ground was a former speedway and football ground which was once located where Amy Park is today. The Motordrome hosted Melbourne's first 3 home games in 1932 as rain had delayed the resurfacing of the MCG. These 3 games were rounds 2, rounds 4 and round 6 of 1932. As you may have already gathered, the early 1940s saw many VFL venues commandeered for military use, which forced affected teams to temporarily relocate. We now move on to the ovals that were first introduced during this period. Of these new ovals, first up we have Kardinia Park in South Geelong, also known today as GMHBA Stadium under naming rights. It was first used for VFL games in 1941, meaning the first game played here was in round 2, 1941. As I mentioned earlier, Geelong moved here for the 1941 VFL season, as their original home ground, Corio Oval, was being used by the military. Following the war, the move became permanent, and since then it has been Geelong's primary home ground. Geelong currently hold the title of the second longest current tenure at their home ground, only behind Melbourne at the MCG. Kardinia Park is also used as Geelong's administrative and training base, and as well as hosting most of its AFL games, it hosts its VFL and AFLW home games as well. 1942 saw the next 2 new ovals that were played at due to teams relocating during the war, Yarraville Oval and Toorak Park. Yarraville Oval in Yarraville was used as Footscray's home ground for the 1942 season. The first game to be held there was in round 2, 1942 against Essendon, and the last game to be played there was in round 16, 1942 against Fitzroy. Today the oval is used by the Yarraville Seddon Football Club in the Western Region Football League. Toorak Park in Armidale was St Kilda's home ground for 2 years from 1942 to 1943. The first game to be played there was in round 2, 1942 against Hawthorn, and the final game to be played there was in round 10, 1943 against Fitzroy. Today it is used by the Paran and the Old Xaverians Football Club in the Victorian Amateur Football Association. Now we move on to the new grounds played on in the aforementioned propaganda round, which, if you forgot, was in round 8, 1952. The round saw teams play in country and interstate venues in an attempt to spread interest in the sport. The grounds played at were, on the 14th of June, the Albury Sports Ground, Yallourn Oval, Yarraville Oval, North Hobart Oval and the SCG, which we've already spoken about. And then on the 16th of June, a final game was played at the Brisbane Exhibition Ground. The Albury Sports Ground in Albury hosted the match which saw South Melbourne defeat North Melbourne. The ground is typically used by the Albury Football Club in the Ovens and Murray Football League. Yarraville Oval, also known as Yarraville Memorial Oval, is in Yarraville and hosted the match between Carlton and Hawthorn, which saw Carlton win by 37 points. The ground is today used by the Yarraville Football Club who play in the Goulburn Valley Football League. Yallourn Oval in the former town of Yallourn hosted the game between Footscray and St Kilda. The ground doesn't exist anymore as the town doesn't even exist anymore, as an extension of an adjustment mine led to the town's closure and removal in the 1980s. North Hobart Oval in North Hobart hosted the match between Fitzroy and Melbourne, which saw Fitzroy win by 20 points. However, this was not the end of football in North Hobart, as in 1991, Fitzroy returned to the ground to play 2 home matches there every year. But since Fitzroy were a struggling side at the time, and also suffered the biggest losing margin of their history there, losing to Hawthorn by 157 points, crowd numbers were dwindling, and they left after only 2 seasons. They played a total of 4 games there in the 1990s, with the last game to be played there in round 17, 1992. Today, the North Hobart Oval is the home ground of the North Hobart Football Club in the Tasmanian State League. The last ground to cover that hosted a VFL game during propaganda round was the Brisbane Exhibition Ground in Bowen Hills, which is now known as the Brisbane Showgrounds. It hosted a night game 2 days after the other 5 games, as it was rescheduled due to torrential rain. The match was between Geelong and Essendon, which saw Essendon comfortably win by 69 points. This was also the first official VFL game to be held under floodlights. The ground doesn't host much football today as it is mostly used for events in Brisbane. As the 1960s rolled around, some teams began to feel as though they'd outgrown their traditional home grounds and sought to relocate to further out in their respective corridors of growth. 2 teams made switches like this in 1965, St Kilda to Moorabbin Oval and North Melbourne to the Coburg City Oval. Moorabbin Oval, today known as RSEA Park under naming rights, is located in Moorabbin and was the home ground of the St Kilda Football Club from 1965 to 1992. St Kilda made the move at the end of the 1964 season from their traditional home ground at Junction Oval with the desire to operate their own home ground without having to comply with the cricket club. The first game to be played there was on the 17th of April 1965, which was round 1, and the final game to be played there was in round 20, 1992. Following 1992, it remained St Kilda's training base until the end of the 2010 season when they moved their primary training facility to Seaford. However, St Kilda then returned to training at Moorabbin in early 2018 and have remained there to this day. St Kilda also play their AFLW games at Moorabbin Oval. The Coburg City Oval in Coburg hosted its first league game 2 days after Moorabbin on the 19th of April, which was also in round 1, 1965. North Melbourne's move was initially intended to be permanent as they sought a long-term lease, but in the end they moved back to Arden Street after only 1 season. The final game to be played there was in round 18, 1965. Today the ground is used by the Coburg Lions in the current VFL. The next new ground that saw VFL games was VFL Park itself, aka Waverley Park. Waverley Park, located in Mulgrave, was a league-owned neutral ground for teams to play at. The original plan was for it to eventually host all the grand finals in the future, with a planned capacity of 157,000 and to become the primary football stadium. However, this vision never availed. The first game to be played there was a game between Fitzroy and Geelong in round 3, 1970. It hosted many blockbuster games for the next few decades, even hosting the 1991 AFL Grand Final when the EMCG was undergoing the construction of the Great Southern Stand, now called the Shane Warne Stand. In 1992, it ceased being a neutral venue and became Hawthorn's home ground. In 1993, it became St Kilda's home ground as well. Hawthorn and St Kilda both played their home games at Waverley Park until 1999 when the league announced that it would stop hosting games at Waverley altogether. The AFL wanted to sell the land in order to raise funds for a new stadium in Docklands. The final game to be played there was in round 22, 1999, which saw Hawthorn defeat Sydney by 85 points. After some renovations which involved turning the former land used for the stands and car parks into housing, the ground and remaining stand is now owned by the Hawthorn Football Club and has been their primary training and administrative base since early 2006. Next up we have the Brisbane Cricket Ground, or more commonly referred to as the Gabba. It is located in the Brisbane suburb of Wollongabba. The first game to be played here was in round 14, 1981, between Hawthorn and Essendon. Even though the Brisbane Bears joined the competition in 1987, the ground wasn't used again until 1991, as Brisbane initially played their home games at Carrara on the Gold Coast. They played 4 home games there in 1991 before moving all home games there from 1993 onwards. So from then until 1996 it was the Brisbane Bears home ground, and then since 1997, which was when Brisbane and Fitzroy merged, it has been the Brisbane Lions home ground. The Gabba is still Brisbane's home ground, and even notably became the first venue outside of Victoria to host the grand final, as it hosted the 2020 grand final due to COVID restrictions in Melbourne. Round 1 1987 saw Subiaco Oval host its very first VFL game. Subiaco Oval can be found in Subiaco in Perth, and was the primary home ground for West Coast from its inception in 1987, and Fremantle from its inception in 1995, up until it was closed for good and later demolished following the 2017 AFL season. The final game to be hosted there was in round 23, 2017 between West Coast and Adelaide. Whilst the entire structure of the stadium was demolished, the playing surface was retained and is used by a high school located there named Bob Hawke College. Next up we have Carrara Stadium, which is in Carrara on the Gold Coast. This was the original home ground of the Brisbane Bears and hosted its first VFL game in round 4, 1987. The stadium was Brisbane's home ground from 1987 until 1992, as they moved permanently to the Gabba in 1993. It wasn't used for another league game until 2006, when a couple of neutral games were held there. Then in 2007, the Kangaroos announced that they would be playing 3 home games there every year for 3 years. Following the 2007 season, the AFL offered them the opportunity to permanently relocate to the Gold Coast. However, after they refused, their home games there suffered poor crowds and they ended their 3-year deal after only 2 years. 3 games were still played during the 2009 season, but North Melbourne didn't play in them. The ground then received a redevelopment so that it could be the home ground for the new Gold Coast Suns, who were set to join the AFL in 2011. The ground wasn't quite completed by then, so Gold Coast played their first few home games at the Gabba, before it was finally completed for Gold Coast's first home game there in round 10, 2011. Since then it has been primarily Gold Coast home and training base, with the only games played there that weren't Gold Coast home games being games during the 2020 and 2021 COVID restricted seasons. It also notably hosted a semi-final in 2020. The next ground we have is the Western Australian Cricket Association ground, or more commonly known as the WACA. The WACA is located in East Perth and saw its first game in round 7, 1987. It hosted some of West Coast and then later Fremantle's home games from 1987 to 2000, 1995 to 2000 for Fremantle. The last game to be played there was in round 19, 2000. Today it is predominantly just a cricket ground. Now we move to 1991, which saw Adelaide join the league with their home ground being Football Park. Football Park in West Lakes was Adelaide's home ground from 1991 to 2013 and Port Adelaide's home ground from 1997 also to 2013. The ground was the Sampl's equivalent of VFL Park, with it being a big neutral stadium that was built in the growing outer suburbs. The final game to be played there was in round 23, 2013, as from 2014 onwards both Adelaide and Port moved their home games to the Adelaide Oval. Today all the stands have been demolished, but it is still Adelaide's training and administrative base. The next ground up is Bruce Stadium, also known as GIO Canberra Stadium. It is located right next to the AIS in Bruce, Canberra. This stadium saw 1 game played there, which was in round 9, 1995 between Fitzroy and West Coast. Today it is the home ground of the Canberra Raiders in the NRL. Next up is Manuka Oval, which is located in Griffith, which is also in Canberra. It hosted its first AFL game in round 18, 1998, which was between North Melbourne and Port Adelaide, and then it was again used by the Kangaroos from 2001 to 2006, with them playing 3 home games there every year. From 2007 to 2011, 1 or 2 games were played there every year, with either Melbourne or the Bulldogs playing. Since the introduction of the GWS Giants in 2012, it has been their secondary home ground, with them playing 3 games there every year. Now we move on to Docklands Stadium in Docklands, which saw its first AFL game in round 1, 2000. It was originally built as a second stadium in Melbourne and became the replacement to Waverley Park. Since 2000, it has regularly hosted home games for Essendon, St Kilda, the Western Bulldogs, North Melbourne, and since 2005, also Carlton. However, it has hosted home games for every Victorian team at least once or twice. It has gone by many sponsored names over the years. It went from Colonial Stadium to Telstra Dome to Etihad Stadium and is now Marvel Stadium. York Park in Launceston was the next ground to host an AFL game, with its first game being played there in round 6, 2001. The ground has primarily been a home away from home for the Hawthorn Football Club, with the Hawks playing 4 games there a year. It also hosted a couple of St Kilda home games in the early 2000s, as well as 2 elimination finals in 2021 due to COVID restrictions. Today it is also known commercially as University of Tasmania Stadium, or more commonly UTAS Stadium. However, it has also previously been called Aurora Stadium. It is suspected that once the Tasmania Devils join the AFL in 2028, Hawthorn will stop playing home games there. Stadium Australia in Sydney Olympic Park was the next stadium to host AFL games. It is probably best remembered from its former sponsored names, Telstra Stadium and ANZ Stadium. It hosted all of Sydney's blockbuster games as well as their home finals, and then later it started hosting GWS home games to Sydney. The first AFL game to be played there was in round 9, 2002. Sydney moved all of their home games to the SCG in 2016, however they did play a qualifying final against GWS there that year. The only game to be played there since was the Sydney Derby in round 1, 2022. Moorara Oval, or known under naming rights as TIO Stadium, is located in Moorara in Darwin, and hosted its first AFL game in round 20, 2004. From 2004 to 2009, the Bulldogs played 1 home game there every year. Then from 2010 to 2011, the Bulldogs, Melbourne and Richmond played 4 home games there between them, with the away team always being Port Adelaide. Then 2012 and 2013 saw 4 games played there, 1 home game for Melbourne and the Bulldogs each year, and then from 2014 to 2019, only Melbourne played a home game there every year. Since 2020, it has hosted a few Gold Coast home games. It also notably hosted the Dreamtime at the G match between Essendon and Richmond in 2020. Moving on to Cazalys Stadium in Cairns, which hosted 1 AFL game every year from 2011 to 2018. The first game to be played there was in round 17, 2011. From 2011 to 2013, the matches were always Richmond home to Gold Coast. Then from 2014 to 2017, they were the Bulldogs home to Gold Coast, and then in 2018, it was Gold Coast home to North. The stadium made a return in 2020 when it hosted a game every round from round 15 to round 18 due to COVID. In round 13, 2021, Cazalys Stadium saw St Kilda play a home game to Adelaide as a replacement to St Kilda's cancelled match in Shanghai. They then played another game there in round 7, 2022, this time against Port Adelaide. Round 7, 2022 is currently the last game to have been played there. Adelaide Oval in North Adelaide saw its first AFL game in round 24 of 2011 in a match between Port Adelaide and Melbourne. That was originally scheduled for Football Park but was moved. It didn't host another AFL game until round 2, 2014, and since then it has been the main home ground for Adelaide and Port Adelaide. It has hosted non-Adelaide team games a couple of times in recent years due to COVID in 2020 and 2021, and Gather Round in 2023 and 2024. Bellerive Oval, or probably better known as Blundstone Arena, is in the suburb of Bellerive in Hobart and has seen North Melbourne play some home games there every year since 2012. The first game to be played there was in round 2, 2012, which saw the Kangas annihilate GWS by 129 points. There was also 1 non-North Melbourne game played in Hobart in round 23, 2021. Today, North plays 4 home games there a year. Blacktown International Sports Park in Rooty Hill in Western Sydney was GWS's original training base and saw them play 1 actual game there in round 3 of 2012. The game was against West Coast and saw GWS lose by 81 points. Sydney Showgrounds Stadium in Sydney Olympic Park has been GWS's main home ground since round 9, 2012, and they played their first home game there. 3 finals have been played there as well as 5 neutral games during the COVID years. Wellington Regional Stadium in Wellington, New Zealand saw St Kilda play a home game on Anzac Day from 2013 to 2015. The first game was therefore round 5, 2013, and the final game was round 4, 2015. Traeger Park, or TIO Traeger Park under naming rights, is located in Alice Springs and saw its first AFL game in round 11 of 2014. Since 2014, Melbourne has hosted 1 home game there every year, aside from 2021, when travel to the Northern Territory was restricted due to COVID. Jiangwan Stadium in Shanghai, China has seen 3 AFL games, with the first being in round 8, 2017. Port Adelaide played one away game there a year from 2017 to 2019. The game for 2020 was cancelled due to COVID restrictions, and any further plans for games there haven't come to fruition, leaving the last game to be played there in round 11 2019. Eureka Stadium, or Mars Stadium under naming rights, is in Wendouree, Ballarat, and hosted its first AFL game in round 22 2017. Since then, it has been a home away from home for the Western Bulldogs, as they have played a couple games there every year. The only non-Bulldogs game to be played there was a match between GWS and Gold Coast in 2021 that was moved due to a COVID outbreak in Sydney. Perth Stadium, known commercially as Optus Stadium, is located in the suburb of Burswood in Perth and has been West Coast and Fremantle's home ground since 2018. The first game to be played there was therefore in round 1 2018. It also hosted a few neutral games during the COVID years, most notably the 2021 Grand Final, which saw Melbourne end their 57-year premiership drought as they defeated the Western Bulldogs by 74 points. Next up is Riverway Stadium in Townsville, which hosted one AFL game in round 13 2019 between Gold Coast and St Kilda. Now we move on to the final two grounds for today's video, which were the two new grounds introduced in Gather Round 2023, Norwood Oval and Summit Sport and Recreation Park. Norwood Oval in Norwood saw its first game on Friday the 14th of April in Gather Round 2023, which was round 5. Across this year and last year, it has hosted a total of 4 games, 2 in each year's respective Gather Round. Summit Sport and Recreation Park, or just Summit Sports Park, is located in Mount Barker in the Adelaide Hills and saw its first AFL game on Saturday the 15th of April in Gather Round 2023. As of now, it has seen a total of 3 games, only hosting 1 in Gather Round last year and hosting 2 in Gather Round this year. So there you have it, all 50 grounds that an official VFL AFL game has ever been played at. Let me know which videos you would like to see in the future, and if you haven't already, then join my tipping competition. That's all from me, and I'll see you all next time.